Welcome back to the Britt Mayer Show. Today, we are diving into a question that's reshaping lives and our future. What does in vitro fertilization really mean? This isn't just about science or hope. It's about the cost, the ethics, and the unseen toll. We are joined by Leigh Ann Woznica to unpack Cradled in Glass. It's a multi-episode documentary series from Lucidity Pictures that pulls no punches. From the heartbreak of lost embryos to embryo adoption, legal battles, and experiments pushing moral lines, this series and Leigh Ann's story demand that we look closer. This is a raw, urgent look at IVF's frontier from someone on the front lines. Let's get started. But first, a word about the sponsor of this episode. This episode is brought to you in part by We Heart Nutrition. We Heart Nutrition is a phenomenal line of supplements. I have tried so many products on the market that have always delivered half the results I'm looking for or insignificant results. So I am extremely picky about the supplements that I consistently use and that I would ever recommend to you. I have been using We Heart Nutrition now for long enough to be able to confidently tell you that I have seen the results that are promised. I am so thankful for the fact that they are clean, that they are third-party tested, and not only that, but the company that stands behind their products is very public about being pro-life, pro-family, very pro-conservative values. So I feel good while taking their products. And I also feel really good about supporting a company that is aligned with my values and doesn't fight against my values. I have noticed the most significant difference since using their magnesium at night. My sleep has improved completely. And my husband raves about their product line for men. So I would encourage you to check out weheartnutrition.com if you are looking for top shelf supplements that is backed by a company that aligns with your values. Check out weheartnutrition.com. Leigh Ann, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us and to talk through this issue of IVF that I feel like we're not fully able to really talk about because we don't know all the details of what IVF entails. And you have people on both sides of what has become a very emotional conversation where you have people who say IVF should be completely outlawed. And then you have others who say, but look at my beautiful miracle babies that came out of IVF. How could this be wrong? And somewhere in the middle, the facts and the details get a little muddy and murky. So that's what we're going to work through today from your perspective as someone who did go through IVF and what your thoughts are on the other side. So let's start with your hysterectomy that left you with IVF or surrogacy as your only shot at a genetic child. Let's go back to that final failed cycle. And just after the loss of those embryos and spending a fortune, what broke you to say this wasn't worth it? And just the story behind that.
So in 2009, I had a partial hysterectomy for a plethora of reasons. And so I still had my ovaries. And my husband, who I married in 2019, is younger than I am, and we wanted to have children. But obviously, I not having a uterus or a cervix, that wasn't possible for us to do naturally. So IVF was the option that we chose. And we went down a lot of different roads. I even went so far as to look into cadaver uteruses because I wanted to carry his child so badly. And when I decided to have that hysterectomy, I already had a biological child, and I never in my wildest dreams would have thought that I would want to have children, any more children. So if I could go back, I probably would have not had that hysterectomy, but here we are. So we decided on IVF as our option because he really wanted a biological child, and I wanted that for him, not really knowing much about IVF. And we went through 4 cycles. The second cycle that we went through, we had 10 eggs, 8 of which fertilized, which was kind of unprecedented because I was already in my 40s at the time. And those 8 that fertilized didn't make it to the blastocyst stage, which is the 6-day stage for IVF. And so because of that, they were terminated. So for us, we got the phone call that they did not make it to that 6th day. And we lost 8 children because
Wow.
conception happens.
How do you take a phone call like that?
With a lot of tears.
Yeah.
And a lot of sadness. I mean, I don't know what it's like for someone to have a miscarriage, but I now know what it's like to have an awful lot of children and not get to see any of them born.
I would think that knowing that you had 8 little embryos waiting, you would have thought, well, for sure you're going to come through with 1 or 2.
We
So
were
to get
so
that.
excited. We were so excited.
Oh,
We
I
just
bet.
knew.
Mm-hmm.
But we soldiered on and did 2 more rounds.
So you did 2 more rounds after that. What's a round like for people who are unfamiliar with when you say you did 2 more rounds after that significant loss? What does a round look like?
A round looks like a lot of shots, a whole lot of shots. You are taking different hormones at different times of the day. So you have morning shots and you have evening shots, and you have to take those shots at the very specific time that is given to you to take them. And there is a lot of, so you're injecting yourself with all of these hormones. You're basically creating an ovulation cycle in the heart of your menstrual cycle, but you're forcing it, right? You're creating this forced ovulation cycle, and your ovaries get large, and the idea is to get as many eggs as you can. So you're going in every single day for an ultrasound to see if your follicles are growing, and then you start taking anti-ovulation shots on top of the other shots. And then 36 hours before they want to take the eggs, you take what's called a trigger shot, and you're still taking anti-ovulation drugs. And the trigger shot is what creates ovulation, starts the process, and then you go in and have egg retrieval.
How long is that whole process of all those shots?
10 days to 2 weeks.
10 days to 2 weeks, and then you go in. Is it like a pap smear, or what's that process like when you go in clinic?
To have the eggs removed?
Yes.
Oh, they put you under.
You're fully under.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're fully under. It was total anesthesia for about 10 minutes. So you don't feel anything. And while you're doing that, they put your husband or your partner, if you're not married, into a room with all the material needed for them to give them his sample.
So is that done on the same day then? It typically, so you go under and you have eggs harvested, and then he goes in a little room with porn and magazines and videos, and he's just told to get it done, put it in a cup, and
Yep.
then, so those are your very different experiences.
Very different
Very
experience.
different.
You want to talk about a way to separate a husband and wife, right? Here, take your husband who, obviously loves you so much he's going through this process, but now they're telling him to go look at someone else so he can create a baby with you.
Oh, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's creepy.
Yeah, it's very creepy. Looking back on it now, we definitely see that at the time. And this is what I understand about people having been one of them, who are so desperate to create a life. You'll do pretty much anything, which includes kind of working against your own values without realizing that's what you're doing. And it's the aftermath that creates the pain. So I'm post-abortive, right? The aftermath of that is where the pain came in. It wasn't in the moment. It was way later.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I can see it being something where you almost smudge the lines because you're thinking of what's beyond that. The ultimate goal it makes exceptions for what you're doing in the moment because of the ultimate goal. It's like that kind of a value system has to shift in the moment. So you go in, you have your eggs harvested, he has the sperms collected, and then what happens from that point forward?
Within minutes probably of that happening, and they take it into the lab. They combine them all, however they do that, and I'm not sure how all that works. I know Cradled in Glass is going to explain that, but they put them together to see if they fertilize, and if they fertilize, which is within the first 10 hours, I think, then they tell you how many fertilized, usually on the same day or the next morning, and then you wait until that 6th day to see if they reach that blastocyst stage. And then the clinic that we were using, if they reached the blastocyst stage, and I don't know, honestly, it's been a long time, if this was strictly due to my age or if this was their policy for everyone, but we had to send any embryos that made it to that blastocyst stage had to go in for genetic testing before they would consider surrogacy. I would imagine with the surrogate that would be required. In fact, no, I do know with the surrogate that was required. I don't know if they were going to do a live implantation or fresh implantation if it was required, but for a surrogate, which was our only option, they had to go through genetic testing.
So then that genetic screening basically is, I mean, if we call it what it is, it's eugenics, because it's selecting the most viable, the one that they think has the most, they get the blue ribbon. The ones that get the blue ribbon to progress toward birth, correct? And then what happens with the others that are deemed not as valuable?
It was really up to us if we would want to. Well, actually, for us, okay, here we go back to the surrogate. Because of the laws in the state that we were in, the genetic failures would not be viable, so they would have been destroyed. So surrogacy laws are very strict, and that's the other piece of it that, you know, looking back on it, we realize the risks that we were taking for that as well, because we had all these babies. What were we going to do with them? Had all of them been viable? You know, we knew we didn't want to destroy them, but they still got destroyed. And we had to sign a contract, you know, telling them if we wanted them donated to science, frozen, or destroyed. Of course, we chose frozen, but then what would we do after? We proceed.
How do you decide to? So you did a total of how many cycles? 4 total cycles. Your first cycle was that massive loss. You go back in.
Second cycle.
The second cycle was the massive loss. What happened after that with the 2 additional cycles that you did?
The third cycle we did, my mom was really sick, and so the progression wasn't happening the way it needed to happen, and they actually canceled the cycle because they didn't want me to waste the money. Praise the Lord. But it's still, we were thousands of dollars into it by the time we canceled the cycle. And then the fourth cycle, we actually went to a separate doctor. We changed clinics and went to a different clinic with a different doctor who had a totally different protocol. And that cycle was, in terms of follicle growth and potential egg release, the best cycle that I'd had. And we were really excited. We thought that we were going to get tons of eggs, but I ovulated. Even taking anti-ovulation drugs, I ovulated the day I went in to have my eggs released or harvested. And part of the reason why I believe that happened was because they were an hour and a half late getting me into surgery.
So it's literally by the minute. Like if you miss it by a few minutes, then you're thousands of dollars gone. Yes. Because you already ovulated.
Every medication cycle was between $5,000 and $8,000. Just the medication.
Oh my gosh.
So think we did that 4 times.
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
A lot of money and a lot of emotion. And I can even imagine as you're spending that money, that commitment level rises where you feel like, well, we're in this far. Yeah. Man. Before we go further, I want to ask you about balancing compassion in this conversation with reality, because I know that a lot of people who are going to listen to this have already gone through IVF, or they have infertility issues, or for whatever reason they are considering IVF. And how do you, as someone who has gone through this experience, how do you walk the line between the facts that we're going to get into and the issue of compassion in this conversation?
Well, at the time that we did it, I was uninformed, very much uninformed. I became more and more informed as we went through it because I dug in and did so much research. And so by the end, I was finally to that point where I knew ethically I couldn't do it anymore for a number of reasons, which I know we'll talk a little bit about, but I also just couldn't do it because my emotions couldn't handle it anymore. It's not only are you on a roller coaster ride because you're taking so many hormones and creating this, ridiculous ovulation, PMS combined cycle for yourself, but there's a lot of loss. I mean, 4 cycles
Yeah.
4 hopeful cycles and no living children to show for it, that's a lot. And I am not a lone wolf in that. There are more cases like mine than not. Um, but I understand better than anyone could how badly somebody wants to have a child. And my situation is I couldn't have a natural child if I wanted to. So this was our only option outside of adoption.
Mm-hmm.
I get it. I have so much compassion for people who want to have children, but I also know that God creates circumstances for a reason. And I believe that there are other ways. And I know for a fact, just through that final cycle that I did, had I had a uterus, I probably would have had a baby.
Hmm.
There are because I was under a totally different health protocol, eating protocol, supplement protocol. So I know that there are good ways to create that fertility without having to go through the expense and pain of IVF.
Yeah, I think that that's something that has to be addressed as like a coupling piece of this whole conversation is the infertility issue. And instead of just slapping a band-aid on it and saying, well, we can just harvest eggs and someone else can have the baby, it's like, no, let's get to the root and figure out why so many women are infertile. Like what's going on? This is an alarming trend to see so many women unable to have babies and have to lean into something, you know, in some ways that's hasty in the sense of like it's just thrown at you as the fix. I know so many people who have gone through IVF because it kind of seemed like the only solution, and then come to find out there were other things that could have been pursued, and they just felt like IVF was the only answer.
Right. And used a very important word, hasty. People don't have the patience, you've spoken about your Christian faith. If you look at Sarah, I mean, I'm a Christian too. Sarah was in her 90s when she
Yeah.
had her baby. Obviously, that's not going to happen today. But the point being, like, you know, if we would just work on finding that root cause and then wait for God to open the womb, a lot of these infertile women would probably have very healthy children. But IVF has created this ability for impatience to be answered quickly
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
at a cost.
Yeah, at a cost. Well, let's talk a little bit more about these cycles and the moment that you came to that decision that you were done. You're not going to do any more cycles. What if you could go back and warn your younger self about what you now know? What would you say to her?
Considering our circumstances, the thing I would probably say to her now is, adoption is definitely a good out outcome. Desperation is not the answer. And I'm trying to be very gentle in this because I know my husband really wanted a biological child,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the hardest part for me as a female, to not be able to provide that. But knowing what I know today about IVF and about the number of children that we've lost, and God love him, when we talk about it today, he says, we have 8 babies that we get to meet when we get to heaven, and that's
Mm.
just the most beautiful thing in the world. But so we have biological
Yeah.
children now, but I would probably tell myself to consult adoption agencies before doing this today. It's a lot of loss.
It's a lot.
And to be honest with you, for the money that we spent on IVF, we could have adopted 2 children,
Hmm.
maybe more.
I was looking up statistics, and currently, right now, only 7 to 8% of human embryos that are created via IVF are actually born. That's shocking. And we currently, as of this recording, there are about 1.5 million frozen embryos in the United States. That is the same number as a population of San Antonio, Texas, or Phoenix, Arizona. What do you make of those numbers?
Every time an egg is fertilized, a child is lost in those numbers, apart from that 7 to 8%. I would be really curious to know, and I have not done this research, how many eggs are fertilized every hour. There are more people trying to do IVF today because it's become so readily available. And like in our situation, we sold a house so we could afford it. We took out a loan so we could afford it. You know, people will do a lot of desperate things to afford IVF. And when you look at that number of live births compared to the number of embryos that are created, it's it's devastating.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to imagine that much loss, that many little lives floating around in heaven.
When I was looking at the data on this and I found that 1.5 million number in comparison to those cities, I was really shocked. I didn't expect it to be as large as that. Going back to like the personal side of it, you know, the 8 human embryos that didn't make it, they died in a petri dish, not your womb. How does
Correct.
that, how do you feel? Like, how do you, because I've never gone through IVF. I did have fertility issues, but we actually pursued nutrition
Mhm.
and both with both of my kids. And even we incorporated traditional Chinese medicine with my son because my progesterone was so low. I wouldn't have been able to keep a baby. But I just was dead set on wanting to pursue all alternative medicine in our journey. So I didn't go through IVF, but I'm curious how you feel looking back on that with because this is a reality for women who go through IVF. It's very rare for all of the babies created to actually make it into implantation and then for sure to make it to live birth. So how does it feel as someone who went through that, knowing that you lost 8 babies in a cold lab in a petri dish and not in your womb?
I don't know that that result would be tremendously different for me versus someone else. I think for from my perspective, there may be a little more guilt. I mean, I know that women who have miscarriages, I've talked to plenty of them. You know, they wonder what they did wrong, why they lost their baby. Um, Most people who have miscarriages miscarry one child at a time.
Yeah.
We lost 8 at a time. Um, I think because they were in a petri dish, I, I, I think it kind of splits the level of guilt versus the level of loss. Um, but it wasn't as real as having a baby in the womb. So I think it definitely takes different waves of emotion. And it's been so many years now, and I've talked about it so much that I don't have as much emotion, but I can tell you my experience with talking about it on Cradled in Glass was very emotional. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't think anyone wants that outcome,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's in the womb or in the petri dish.
Mm-hmm.
There is a level of guilt that I feel today knowing what I know about IVF for having done it.
Yeah. Let's get into a little bit of that with Cradled in Glass, which we opened with. It involves personal stories, like the microcosm of IVF, and it makes it very personal. So, with that, what do you hope viewers are going to take from your story and all the other stories that are shown in those first few episodes of Cradled in Glass?
You know, the reality is that it's informed consent more than anything. It's hearing exactly what IVF can and can't do. I mean, there's a couple that adopted an embryo and had a successful, well, they adopted multiple embryos and finally had a successful birth. There's my story of having no successful live births. There's going to be a story about a woman who did have successful births and then still has an embryo frozen. Um, but I think the reality, what I would really like to see people take away from this is that they are going to that there is a very large chance that they will suffer loss. I mean, it is informed. I think that the narrative around IVF is so positive all the time about how we can bring babies into your life that the hard part is never discussed. And that is the hard, cold facts about IVF. The loss is never discussed. Of course, it's not ever discussed because they want the money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a
That's
huge
my
money make.
personal take. I am not going to say that that is Cradled in Glass's take, but Cradled in Glass definitely exposes the hard, cold facts about the amount of money it takes, along with those numbers. That's 7 to 8% of live births. That's a
Yeah,
lot.
it is a lot. It's a booming industry with significant human casualty.
Yeah.
What do you feel about the stories where you see the frozen embryos that are just in the suspended waiting period, and a lot never even make it to a live birth? We
That
have
part,
I mean, there are so many to really picture. I want people to picture San Antonio, Texas, or
mm,
Phoenix, Arizona, all those people just frozen in limbo. That's the reality of this industry.
yeah, the idea that, and this is the other piece of it that I want to be really careful when I discuss this, but the terminology that is used is, the potential for life. And so I think that the reality is that people don't realize that these are living people in
Absolutely. Yes.
embryonic phase, right?
Yes.
So, and I love that you use the analogy of San Antonio and Phoenix, because that's the reality. I mean, that those are tiny, tiny little people
Mm-hmm.
that are living in a cryo freeze state
Mm-hmm.
constantly. And how long do they get to stay like that?
Mm-hmm.
When is their time up?
Mm-hmm.
What's the expiration date on these? And different facilities have different policies around that. And so it is devastating to imagine that there are so many human lives that will probably never see the light of day, but yet they're just sitting there. And the adoption process, I mean, what we've learned now about thawing them out and what the success rate is for a thawed
What is that?
embryo,
That's a new territory for me. So I'd love for you to share what you know about that.
from a conservative standpoint, about 5% of thawed embryos make it.
Oh my gosh.
That's conservative. They
Gosh.
they don't thaw very. I mean, so it's going to be really interesting as this docu-series comes out and starts to explain this process, because that's the whole purpose behind Cradled in Glass, is explaining the process of IVF, not just giving, real world stories of people who have gone through it successfully and unsuccessfully and adopting embryos and having children, but the hard the reason it's called Cradled in Glass is because it is hard, cold facts
Mm-hmm.
of embryos being frozen in glass.
I've shared before that one of the things that initially, this was years ago, it was actually a decade ago, one of the first things that made me really start to think about IVF differently than just it being like this clinical process and, kind of taking the humanity out of it. I had my firstborn, I had her at swimming lessons, and she was just a few months old, and I'm holding her and I'm chatting it up with another mom who's holding her little 6-month old. And, as a new mom, you're desperate for adult to adult conversation. And so we're having this conversation about kids and babies and, are you going to have any more babies? And we're first time moms. And I said, we'll probably have one or two more. I had really difficult pregnancies. And then she said she had really difficult pregnancies too. And they had to go through IVF. And so she's like, it was really hard and it was expensive. And I don't know if we'll do it again, but we have, I can't even remember the number now, a bunch of
Yeah.
frozen embryos. And I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, like you're holding one of them, this cute little squishy fat baby, and then you're saying out loud that you have a number of them frozen siblings that were all from this same round. And you don't know. You might just not.
I think when it hits is kind of later in life too. Um, I have a friend who has an embryo still frozen, and her kids are now 14 or 15 years old. And now it's like, what am I going to do with this child?
Hmm.
What am I going to do with this baby that's sitting in a freezer? I'm past the childbearing years. What am I going to do?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, it's kind of one of those afterthoughts because again, it's not really promoted that these are lives,
Right.
it's not a baby yet because it's not in utero. And so I
Well,
think that
is the easy solution in that case to just adopt it out? Just I hear that, well, then you just adopt it out.
this particular friend of mine doesn't want someone else raising her child. So then you have that conundrum to deal with, how do you, I mean, a lot of times you hear people who don't want to give their baby up for adoption because they've carried it in the womb for 9 months, but now you've got this embryo that you worked so hard to make. You spent all this money to make. And do you really want someone else raising your child, not knowing who it is? I mean, do they offer open adoptions with embryos? I'm sure that they do because there's a lot of Christian networks out there that do embryo adoption. But at the same time, do you want someone else raising your
Raising your
child? In a
baby.
lot of cases, especially when it's Christian people, no, they don't. So
Mm-hmm.
then they're in limbo. What do they do with this child?
Mm-hmm. And like you said, it kind of hits you when your kids are already 15. So then are you going to start completely over? And you're a lot older now. You're 15 years
Right.
older. Yeah, that's hard.
Right.
But that's a reality. That's a
It
reality.
is a reality. And the younger you are when you start IVF, the more likely you are to get like what this lady had, a plethora of
Yeah.
embryos versus my situation, which 8 was a lot for somebody my age, but actual frozen embryos, the younger you are, the more you get usually. So then you have all these children,
We
all
had
these.
another situation with some friends who they pursued IVF. So they had their first little baby, so cute. And they had a number more embryos that were viable. And they were all, given the golden star. They were all good to go. And then the wife went psycho and they got a divorce. And he wanted to adopt out the embryos. He wanted them. And she said no. So then he wanted to adopt out and she said no. And it became this huge, ugly legal battle over these embryos because they're living beings. And now you have a mom saying, flush them down the toilet. And you have a dad freaking out and saying, no, like, please just give them like the opportunity to be born. So that's another side of this that isn't often discussed is, that does come up where you have divorces happen and then you literally have babies in limbo waiting on
Yep.
ice for what's going to happen.
Yep. One of the things that we had to deal with when we signed our contract was what if one of us died, or what if we did get divorced? What would we do with those? I will say the clinic that we went through the first round with, or the first 3 rounds with, had a lot of those situations spelled out, like what would you do in these circumstances before we proceeded with the process. But when you're in that phase of life where you're just really wanting a child and you're willing to do whatever, of course you're going to look at those
Yeah.
things and say, that would never happen to me.
Yep. Yes. Yes. Well, as we're talking about Cradled in Glass and this whole docu-series, which is really going to call out the unchecked industry, this wild west of IVF. I wanted to ask you about the terminology in IVF clinics, and because we talked a little bit about that, but how you feel that it can confuse patients into thinking that they've received informed consent, but they haven't really received informed consent. So where do you feel like there are blind spots for women who are considering IVF and what they will be told versus what they actually should be told?
A lot of the time when you're talking to someone about IVF, you're hearing that you have the potential for life. You're hearing that they're going to create the embryo. You're hearing a lot of medical jargon around what life is, but never once, at least in my personal experience, did they say we're creating life. A lot of the conversation around the creation of life, the baby, is discussed post insertion into a uterus, right? So the medical terminology that is used is the possibilities, and the embryo is not really discussed as being a human life. It is just the embryo. So I think that there is just this separation of we need to stay very medical versus what we're actually doing, which is creating a life. And so I think that because of that, it kind of, and I can say this from my own experience, it disassociates what you're doing, playing God, creating a life, versus just really wanting to have a baby. I just
Yeah.
want to have a baby so bad. I'll do whatever I need to do. And so that, and I'm not suggesting that there is this underlying intentional manipulative tactic, although that could be true. But I think that in order um, to ease the pain of when IVF doesn't work and keep people moving forward with it, the discussion of living embryo, life in the embryo is avoided.
Yes, because I could see that causing a lot of women to rethink, and to come up to terms with the loss that is expected from doing business in IVF. So instead of looking at it like, oh, you lost, do they call them embryos? Would that be the term that they clinically use? So you lost 8 embryos, but if it's babies, that feels a lot different. Human babies are
Yes.
gone. I mean, that
Never once was the word baby used in my search situation, not once at either of the clinics that we went to, unless they were talking about someone who had had their baby via IVF.
Yeah, because that's what you can sell. You can sell the success and then kind of minimize the cost of it. What do you think is the most shocking aspect of IVF that people don't realize?
Probably the amount of babies that are sitting in a freezer right now. I think that the selling point of IVF is, like you said, only the success stories. And so what people don't realize is that there are so many unborn children that are frozen right now, and that the success of unfreezing or of thawing those babies and actually having a successful implantation and baby from that is so very low. I think when they do fresh implantations, that's when they get their 7 to 8% success rate. But I think that they really need to be educated on that potential. I mean, because the selling point is, we want to help you have a baby, and we'll do whatever it takes to help you have a baby. But I would be really interested to get a room full of women who had gone through the IVF process and see how many were successful.
Hmm. I would like to know what long-term studies have been done on those babies that are frozen for years and years and years, and then they get the chance of being born and they're born. I have just wondered, that's something that bothers me. Like what are the studies? Because their birth, the day that they are conceived could be years before they're actually born. So they could
Mhm.
have siblings that on earth are, 5, 10, 15 years older than they are, but they biologically are the same age. They were just put in suspension of being frozen for that
Mhm.
amount of time. So how does that play out on life expectancy of autoimmune disorders on their fertility? Like, do you know if this might be totally out of your league because this was not a
It's
prepared question, but I'm
it's a
curious.
it's a fabulous question. The only thing I can tell you is I have heard a story about a woman who had a child via frozen embryo that was 14 years frozen. And all I can tell you is that that child talks about being cold all the time, all the time,
Wow. Oh, that
and
just gave me
knowing that the
chills.
mother is not their mother,
Hmm.
an adopted embryo. So that's the only story I've heard about long-term freezing successful pregnancy implantation. But that is such a fascinating question, and I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't think in the timeline of doing cradling glass that we would be able to do some research on that, but that could be fascinating for a follow-up.
Gosh, I would love if you
Oh, I
guys do that, let me know because I would bring you guys back on to talk through that. I just think that that's like such a missing key in all of this is
mhm.
what does that actually, what does that mean? What does that, there has
Yeah.
to be some ramification. I don't think you can just pause someone's life for that amount of time and then just expect everything's going to be business as usual.
No kidding. I totally agree.
No. Um, Okay, let's talk about overall takeaway on all of this. What you are with this docuseries that's coming out that you're a part of. What are your hopes for viewers to take home in this whole conversation of IVF? What are you hoping that they go home and they really think about, and that they are able to communicate when they're discussing this? And why is this such an urgent conversation that we should even be talking about?
Well, I believe that the urgency behind it, I'm going to go backwards from your questioning. I believe the urgency behind it is the fact that our current government administration is pushing for IVF to be more widely covered.
Yes.
Insurance to cover it.
Mm-hmm.
I've already told you in my personal experience doing 4 rounds, I could have bought a house, paid cash for it probably. Well, maybe not paid cash, but bought a nice house, or adopted 2 or 3 kids. IVF is not cheap. So now we have this administration that wants IVF to become more readily available. The problem with that, in my personal conviction, is that the more readily available IVF is, the less expensive it is for women who are in a hot hurry to have a kid and not willing to do the research on all of the statistics around IVF, the more babies we are going to make and kill.
Mm-hmm.
And so from a ethical perspective, we're looking at a lot of lost lives. The thing that I would like for people to take away, I don't want anyone to ever think that me personally or the Lucidity Pictures, the company that's promoting and producing Cradled in Glass, is looking to pass judgment on anyone who wants to have a baby through IVF. That's not what this is about. IVF is just a brutal topic that is so under discussed on the hard, cold facts about it, that I would just like for anyone who is watching this, who is considering IVF or knows someone who is considering it, to just take a deep breath and do some research before they just pop into a clinic and say, hey, I'm here, make a baby for me. Because the reality is there's more devastation from people that I know of who have done it in my own personal experience. There's more devastation in the long run when you realize that you are or potentially could lose that many children. And, if you're young and considering IVF, I would just want them to take a look at the restorative reproduction option. It sounds like that's kind of the path that you took.
Yeah.
We actually have some restorative reproductive doctors that are going to be in the docuseries talking about finding that underlying issue. The truth is, whatever is causing the infertility can most likely, unless you're like me and don't have a uterus, can most likely be turned around through natural medicine. So that's what I hope people get from this. The expense, the suffering, and the desire to go look for a natural resource.
Tell me about this docuseries and how it's structured. It's multi-episodes, and the first few are personal. You're featured in one of them, and just personal stories, like you said. What does the rest of the docuseries look like?
The rest of the docuseries is going to be a lot of discussion with doctors who are pro-IVF. We have an actual biopsy of an embryo that is the first that we know of ever on a recording. Mm-hmm. We got a high quality recording of a biopsy of an embryo for the genetic testing. Wow. We are going to have doctors on who used to be an IVF doctor. Lauren Rubal is on there. She does the restorative reproductive medicine now, but she was an IVF doctor. We have bioethicists that are going to be on there discussing the eugenics part of it and what the future looks like for creating embryos from stem cells of embryos, which is just a whole other monster that we're looking at now. I mean, I'm telling you this.
Of course it would evolve beyond what it is.
Yeah, this is, so apparently they're already doing this on rats, and now they're looking at doing it on human embryos. So, I mean, it goes deep and dark, and that's really what Cradled in Glass is doing, is exposing that dark side for IVF. because I believe that every woman who wants to go through IVF, who is, heterosexual and looking to build a family, is doing it from a place of what we are
Yeah.
inbred to do, right? We are born and bred to make babies. I get it. But there is a very dark side. And so we expose that in those later episodes. And then we're looking into talking to some attorneys who have fought for IVF and fought against IVF, and congressmen. So we have, oh my gosh. And then we just got into, we just found out that we are going to be able to go to a medical conference and do some filming with some of the biggest bioethicists and doctors. Yeah. So there's a lot of really good stuff happening in the whole series. So yeah, the first part of it's going to be more of our stories, and then it's going to get into the science and the legal, and it's just going to be unbelievably.
When I don't know of any docuseries like this either. I really think that this is the first of its kind, which is exciting, because anytime I talk about IVF, I want people to have resources to go to. I love Katie Faust with Them Before Us. I think she does such a phenomenal job. She's been a guest on this show, and she's lovely and so wise and intelligent. But beyond that, it's kind of limited with what I can offer in terms of good resources that I trust to give you the full story, and not one that's just going to sell you something and not show you all the hidden dark corners. So when can people expect to start seeing your docuseries drop?
Post-production is going to be the end of the summer, and then we will start working on the film festivals. So our goal is to have it out by summer of 2026. We do have some partnerships happening for post-production and for promotion. So if it were possible to push it up, we would. But right now we're looking at summer of 2026.
That's exciting. Well, before I let you go, I threw out to my community just asking, I told them that I was going to be sitting down for a lovely interview with someone who has gone through IVF. And I said, hey, let me know what questions you would want me to ask her. And I got a lot of feedback. So if it's okay with you, I wanted to go through some of those kind of rapid fire.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Great. Okay. So let's see. Some of these you already covered. What securities are in place to reduce the risk of embryos/babies being implanted in the wrong woman?
Oh, I don't know. That was never anything that I mean, I don't remember seeing anything in the paperwork that talked about.
You never know. Did you hear the story recently that happened, that the wrong babies were implanted in the wrong moms? I don't know how they figured it out, but they did. And it was like a huge legal issue.
Yeah, I think there was an ethnicity thing behind it, maybe. Yeah. I'm not sure. And there was another situation where a woman was a surrogate, and she got pregnant with her own kid while she was in the process of, and that was an interesting story.
What happens in that case? Does she keep the kid? It's her child, but she's surrogating for someone else.
What I think happened was they gave the wrong kids to the wrong parents. And then it was kind of surrogacy and embryo implantation can be a scary thing, but I have not heard about security protocols around misimplanted embryos.
I mean, it's kind of a big deal. You'd think that there'd be... But think like what you said is they just go behind the scenes and start mixing and putting like a little, I don't know, like a little colored tab on it and throwing it in the freezer. Like, how do you know you're getting the one that you put in there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they all have assigned numbers to them, because what else would you do with them? But that's a valid question. But a lot of times those security protocols happen when an event like this happens, with the two moms being implanted with the wrong babies. So if there wasn't anything in place before that happened, I'm sure they're working on it now.
Oh, legally they're sweating and they're making all the changes to the contracts. Babies and embryos that are frozen and then not wanted, are they given to science, and what does that look like? So I know that that's an option with some clinics, is they can be what's the term donated is just really weird, but they can be donated to science. Do you know from everything you went through, like in the contract, are there any parameters on how the science can use those embryos? Like, can they develop them to a certain gestation? Can they produce a full baby? And then like what boundaries are there once that
Yeah.
is donated?
I doubt there's parameters in the contract, but I think I still have my contract. I'll look into it.
Okay, I'll put it in the show notes if you get back
Yeah,
to me.
I will
But
get back
that
to you.
the donating to science aspect is another dark thing where it's like, okay, and then this goes into something I was going to ask you, and it probably came up in the questions, but I've heard about the ethical surrogacy where it's like, or the ethical IVF, where the clinic only takes the certain number of eggs that you agree to have implanted. So I only want you to extract 2 eggs, and then we're only going to fertilize 2 eggs. And then I will implant those 2 eggs regardless of whatever abnormalities you find in your eugenics vetting.
Mhm.
Is that actually a reality, or do you find that that's just something that doesn't really exist, but it sounds good to say that?
I think it sounds good to say it. I don't know of any doctor who has agreed to that because they're pushing for numbers. That's the whole idea behind IVF. We want to create as many as we can, therefore we need as many eggs as we can get. So my personal opinion on that would be, and most doctors who are IVF doctors would try to steer you against doing that. However, it's your money. I mean, I guess if you really have the money to spend to do that, because the likelihood, again, we're back to that 6 to 7% or 7 to 8% of live births from embryo implantations, you're back to that very low number. So most doctors will do whatever they can to talk you out of doing that so that your success rate is higher.
Gosh. How much does it cost to store frozen babies?
My one friend pays $60 a month. I don't know outside of that. State by state is probably very different. But my friend in North Carolina pays $60 a month.
$60 a month. I would think
Mhm.
that would be on the low side, just if I
Probably.
had to guess. And then at any point, can they just say your time is up? Is there like a contractual, like you have to decide now, we're not going to keep because I would think that some of these places, it's like, we're running out of space. So you got to decide what you're doing with this. Does that happen?
I don't know about if they were to say that they were running out of space. I know that there is a clinic that closed down and transferred embryos from one clinic to another and lost some. So, I mean, there's definitely there's a lot of risk with storing an embryo just from, a financial perspective in terms of the clinic staying open. I don't know of any clinics that said, hey, your time is up. I do know that the place that we signed up for gave us a 25-year limit.
Gosh, that's so crazy to think. Like, it goes back to the age thing, that you could
Yeah.
have a sibling that's 26 when you're born, but you were both conceived on the same day.
Yeah.
I need someone to research this. Deep
Yes.
dive into it, please.
Yeah.
I need to know. Okay, let's see. Someone asked, are there materials we can acquire to spread the truth about these souls awaiting their fate? Which goes into what you guys are doing.
That's exactly what we're doing, yes. And so acquiring materials, you could go just join Lucidity Pictures email list. We put a newsletter out every single Friday that's either, something that's new and crazy going on in the IVF world, or like we did one a month or so ago about, people are literally cremating their embryos and turning them into jewelry.
Okay, can we talk about that for a second? That's the ring. Okay. I have that saved in my stories to talk about. What the heck is that? They're turning them into like rings, like your little babies are rings, because that's supposed to make you feel better.
Right?
What is that? What's going on?
It's just another way of twisting. It's kind of like people who have, I guess, not had a successful embryo, like kind of my situation where you have one that doesn't make it to blastocyst, or you thaw one and it doesn't live or whatever. And then, so they cremate it and they turn it into jewelry, and that's kind of their little funeral. I mean, I have a friend whose husband died in an avalanche and he was cremated and she turned his ashes into jewelry, but that's a totally different scenario.
That's a little bit different.
For anybody, but
Nope. I mean, I love my dog and he's 16, and when he finally kicks the bucket, I'm not going to cremate him and make him into a ring. Bless his heart. Love him to death. But That is so creepy. I saw those stories, but it just goes again to show the commodification of all of this, that we have somehow detached like the humanity aspect in all of this. But then what's weird is, but we're still, the ultimate goal is the humanity. The ultimate goal is that baby, that's mine. But then in the process of it, it's like we're going to disconnect the humanity. It's this weird ability to cut something off, but eventually that's what you want.
Right. Right.
So one of the comments that I get a lot of is, well, thank God for IVF because I have, and then fill in the blank. I have 2 beautiful grandbabies because of its availability. I have 3 children that I never would have had. I have 1 child who is the most beautiful gift. So are you saying that my child is less than worthy? How do you respond to that?
No child is less than worthy. And if you have a successful IVF that created, that you ended up with kids from, praise be to God, right? I mean, God creates life. I knew you before you were in the womb. It's not about that. Again, we are not here to judge the people who have had children through IVF. I went through 4 cycles myself. I'm not judging myself. We understand that people want to have children. We understand the desperation and the desire to want to have children. What we want people to know is what the reality is behind it. What is actually happening in those clinics with those embryos? What is happening to those frozen embryos? What can we do to help reduce that number so that people will, focus more on bringing life into the world naturally? Because science, as good as science is, there is almost always a dark side to it. I don't care what the scientific.
Good point.
Yeah, I don't care what it is that they're creating scientifically. There's almost always a dark side to it, and IVF is it has a dark side.
Yeah, it's not off limits.
No.
Okay, let's go through just a couple more of these. Eye color selection. How common is it? Is this actually happening?
Eye color selection, I don't know. Sex, definitely. We were in a class, we had to take a 4-hour class, and we were with a couple who was there specifically for a sex. And whatever sex they wanted was what they were going to keep, and everything else was being destroyed.
Gosh. Oh, it just makes me so sad. What about long-term effects on the mother's health? You talked about all of the medication that you have to take. What do you know about that, about all of that?
I don't know other people's long-term effects. I know for me in particular, since that last round, I didn't go into specifics, but that last round when they were so late taking me into surgery, I was in more pain that day than I was in when I was in labor with my daughter. I was in so much pain. My ovaries were so enlarged. So it was like they were engorged. I never had engorged breasts when I had my daughter, but I can imagine that that's probably what it was like.
And all the mamas out there said, amen. We can remember. Oh, yes.
My husband was doing everything he could to try and make me comfortable. I was literally just sliding out of my chair, just begging them to hurry up and take me back. Since then, I have had, because I do still have my ovaries, I have started to have, and I don't know if this is a side effect from that, but I can imagine it probably could be, some of the ovulation cycles, and I'm perimenopausal now. Who knows when I'm not going to be in full menopause, but some of the ovulation cycles that I go through now are so incredibly painful. In fact, 3 months ago, I couldn't even walk. I was just down in the bed with a heating pad on my abdomen, just trying to get the pain to reduce. And it seems to be happening more and more frequently. Maybe it's menopausal, but I don't know if people who've gone through menopause that have that kind of ovarian pain. But I also have had weight gain that I can't seem to get rid of. Again, maybe it's menopausal, but this has been happening since we finished IVF. So,
well, and all the medications, walk us through that, like in a nutshell. I know we talked about it earlier, but the medications basically artificially tell your body how to cycle and then how to super cycle toward the end to get as many of those eggs. So it's doing something in that system.
Absolutely. And again, I went through it 4 times. I don't know how many people have gone through that many cycles. I don't know of any people who have been through that many cycles apart from myself. We were,
you were really trying.
We were overachievers. Yeah. but I would imagine if you continue to inject yourself with those kinds of hormones, there's going to be some latent side effects.
Did they talk to you at the clinics about all that? Did they tell you like, informed consent, this is what these drugs are going to do to your system, and this is the possibility of long-term effects of all of this medication?
No, I mean, you get the pamphlet when you get the
Yeah.
drug, but you also have to go through a special pharmacy to get the drugs. You can't just walk into a CVS and get your stuff. There are specific reproductive pharmacies that provide you with those drugs.
Why is that?
I don't know, honestly.
So you can't just go to Costco and pick up. Wow, I didn't know that.
No, we had
Huh.
very specific places that we had to go to get them.
I wonder why. That's strange to me that it wouldn't be readily available, especially with how many people pursue IVF, that you wouldn't
Right.
just be able to go to CVS and get it. I'm a teacher, and I've noticed most of my IVF children have learning differences. Have you heard anything about this? That would go back to the effects of IVF babies.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that would be a really interesting subject to look into, is the frozen and thawed babies versus the fresh implantations. I
Mm-hmm.
imagine the fresh implantations probably are less likely to have those side effects because they're never frozen. That would be a really interesting topic, but the study on that might be challenging.
Because it involves it would be very challenging. Why does it fail for so many, myself included?
I think a lot of it is, our diet. I think so. I'm going to turn my health
Oh, do
nerd.
it. You have a good community to turn on your health hat.
Um, I have been studying health and nutrition since 2008, and I think that a lot of the nutrition, and I am definitely a tinfoil hat wearer when it comes to the seed oils and the processed foods and all of that. But I
You're in
grew up
very
on,
good company. You're in
yeah.
good company. So welcome. Make yourself comfortable.
And I grew up on it. I mean, I am at the point right now where I am struggling to get menopause weight off, and I am eating clean like crazy. I make everything from scratch in my own
Mm-hmm.
kitchen. But the point is, I think that we are so metabolically sick that it's what creates a lot of infertility. And I don't think taking drugs to create a baby is the answer to overcoming infertility, because you still have to have a quality egg. And where do you get your quality eggs? Well, it comes through your nutrition. So that is the reason that I believe that fourth cycle that we did was so incredible, because I was strictly keto through that whole cycle.
Wow. Interesting. And that's the one
Yep.
that you said you would have gotten the most because if you hadn't ovulated an hour and a half before.
Right. They were the nurses, because like I said in the beginning, you have to go in for an ultrasound every day. And the nurses through that cycle were cracking jokes at me about not letting on when I would walk outside the door of the clinic, because at that point I was 44, I believe, and they didn't even want to do IVF with me. She didn't think I'd have a good cycle. She was shocked at the result of that cycle. But they were cracking jokes at me not to let on how good my follicles were doing and how much they were growing, because they were getting up to 20 centimeters. And the women in their 20s and 30s that were trying to do IVF weren't getting close to that.
And
And I know
that
diet
was your
related.
cycle that you changed up your diet.
Yep. Yep.
Hmm.
So I am going to just say that diet and health and wellness have a lot to do with a successful cycle, but with a successful IVF cycle, but also with a successful natural fertility.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like it's an arena that needs to be investigated in terms of this infertility crisis that we have going on in America. And I know that, we've got Bobby Kennedy in there who is hopefully going to do his best to make America healthy again. I know I'm like, come on, Bobby. But I do agree with you that the whole push that Trump brought on with this IVF being paid for by insurance and taxpayer dollars, I just think is insane. I'm very much against it. I think that it's dangerous too. As soon as you start saying that that's somehow you equate that to a human right. It's not a human right if it's something that we have to pay for, and insurance companies have to pay for the creation of babies, just as I'm opposed to taxpayer funded abortions. Like, I don't think that we should have taxpayer funded abortions. I don't think we should have insurances and taxpayer funding for the creation of humans, knowing that there is such a huge amount of loss in those creations. It just doesn't make sense. I think we should be looking at root cause and how we can solve that instead of slapping a solution on it with, let's just make some babies in a lab.
Great.
So tell me how people can find out more about what you guys are doing, and then sign up for that newsletter that you shared. And then just your final words for women who have made it through this conversation and maybe they were thinking about IVF or someone shared it with them, and they're kind of like, oh my gosh, what do I do with all this information? Just as like the big sister, older mama who went through it, I'd just love for you to close us out with just your sweet wisdom at the end of your journey through all of this.
Gladly. You can find us at luciditypictures.com. And there you can find all of the information about the 6 different episodes that we are going to be producing, and sign up for our newsletter. And the producer writes the newsletter, and she's so energetic and so amazing. And she's such an incredible writer. You'll love it. So I encourage you to go sign up for that. And as far as my final words, I just want to say to anyone out there who is hurting because they're infertile, if you know someone who's hurting because they're infertile, if you really want to believe that IVF is your last opportunity, if you really feel like, if you're in my situation and you don't have a uterus, but you want kids so bad, just remember, there are so many babies out there that need to be adopted, and there are so many embryos out there that could use adoption. Just think about it before you go making more. I understand better than a lot of people do about wanting to have a biological child. I really do. Restorative reproductive medicine is making a huge leap into our naturopathic world. Mm-hmm. I would encourage you to find someone who focuses on that in your community, and start there. Go look at that root cause, because like I told you just a second ago, I switched my diet over to full keto, high fat, and I had an incredible IVF cycle, which leads me to believe that I could have had an incredible pregnancy cycle had I been able to actually have a baby. There is a way. There's a way to open your womb naturally, and pray. Just ask God.
So good. Thank you so much for just being so open and raw and honest and sharing your story. I know that it's always tough to kind of go back and relive loss. So thank you for just being so vulnerable. And I think that's really important, and it's missing in this conversation. So thank you, Leigh Ann. I'm sure we'll have you back on again once the docuseries gets going. I'm excited for that.
Well, I'm honored to get to be a part of your show.